They built 96 houses on land that wasn't theirs. Paved streets, painted walls, families moving in, all on property that still belonged to me. They called me a squatter, a liar, even a criminal. But when the concrete dried, I walked into court with one document that turned their dream neighborhood into my empire. Before we begin, a small favor. If you believe ordinary people deserve justice against powerful developers, please subscribe. It helps more stories like this reach the world. Now, imagine driving 3 hours into the Colorado mountains to scatter your grandfather's ashes, and finding an entire neighborhood where your forest used to stand. The smell of pine was gone, replaced by asphalt and fresh concrete. 96 houses stretched across the hills like an infection. Every roof gleamed new, every mailbox lined in perfect symmetry. At the stone gate, a name was carved deep into granite: Ridgeline Heights, a luxury community that shouldn't exist. The narrator's voice would slow, heavy with disbelief. He'd inherited 47 acres from his grandfather, paid off, tax current, protected by a deed older than half the people now unloading moving trucks. But while he worked 12-hour days and sent property tax payments online every spring, someone else had quietly taken his silence as surrender. Developers had forged claims of abandonment, filed false permits, and poured millions into homes on land that wasn't theirs. Behind the smiling sales agents and glossy brochures hid a single assumption: that the real owner would never come back. He did. That day changed everything. The man who arrived to scatter ashes instead stood among the ruins of his own inheritance, staring at the theft of generations. There was anger, yes, but deeper than that, a calculating calm. He knew construction that big left paperwork, and paperwork always leaves trails. He took photos. License plates. Signs. GPS coordinates. He kept quiet, because silence was a weapon. While they built, he began building something of his own, a case. By night, his kitchen table became a war room, a fortress of old receipts, survey maps, and the original 1971 deed signed in blue fountain pen. In its folds lay his grandfather's final note: "Don't let the bastards take what's yours." The words weren't just advice now, they were a command. Outside, bulldozers flattened what little remained of the forest. Inside, under the glow of a desk lamp, a new plan was forming. He wouldn't fight yet. He'd wait, until every nail, every streetlight, every mailbox stood finished. Because when they believed they had won, he'd strike. That's how Chapter 1 ends, the calm before the storm, as the first families move in, unaware they're living on stolen ground. The next morning, he parked his truck a mile down the road and walked. Fog hung low across the valley, curling around new rooftops like smoke from an old fire that refused to die. He watched as the construction crews packed their tools, laughing, shouting, unaware that every laugh echoed on his land. The man didn't speak to them. He simply memorized faces. He photographed the license plates on their trucks, the company logos, the city inspection tags posted on the fences. Every single one of those stickers would lead to something: a permit, a signature, a name he could trace. Back home, he started a spreadsheet. Each entry was a breadcrumb, each photograph a piece of the trap. He learned that the development was funded through a shell company, registered to an address that didn't exist. He traced the supposed land transfer documents filed by the HOA's law firm, and discovered something incredible. The same notary stamp had been used on multiple forms, on dates when that notary was actually out of state. Fraud. Not small paperwork mistakes, full, deliberate, calculated fraud. But he still said nothing. Not yet. Because this kind of theft thrived on one thing: time. Every day they built another wall, every day another family signed a mortgage, their confidence grew. The deeper they invested, the more catastrophic the truth would become. He wanted them confident. He wanted them finished. Months passed. By spring, Ridgeline Heights had become a shimmering illusion of suburban perfection. Children rode bikes down the smooth new streets, sprinklers hissed across emerald lawns, and HOA volunteers passed out flyers about community events, barbecues, cleanups, board meetings. To the world, it was a model neighborhood. To him, It was evidence. He started attending the HOA's public meetings quietly, sitting in the back corner, unrecognized. He listened to them brag about their success, about the pride of building responsibly. He took notes as they discussed future plans, a park expansion, a community center, maybe even a new gate at the north end, right where his grandfather's barn used to stand. Every time they spoke, his patience hardened. He didn't hate them for living there. He hated them for pretending ownership of something built on lies. Late one night, he drove past the development again. The moonlight reflected off the metal letters of the Ridgeline Heights sign. He stopped his truck and looked at it for a long time. Behind that stone archway stood 96 homes that weren't supposed to exist, a neighborhood on paper, a crime in reality. He gripped the steering wheel and whispered to himself, "Let them finish." He already had what he needed: proof of ownership, photographic evidence of trespass, notarized inconsistencies, and now, an entire neighborhood illegally occupying his property. The trap was almost ready. All that was left was timing. He began contacting people quietly: a retired surveyor who remembered the original boundary lines, a tax official who still kept copies of his grandfather's payments, and finally, a property attorney known for one thing: patience. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about precision. The lawsuit would come when the paint dried, when the HOA believed their control was absolute. He'd watched them mock others online, homeowners who lost their houses over tiny rule violations. They enforced power through humiliation. But soon, that same power would turn to dust in their hands. Summer came. The HOA threw a grand completion party. Music echoed through the valley, grills smoked, and homeowners toasted to their achievement. From a distance, on the hill where his grandfather once built a cabin, he watched quietly with a camera zoom lens. The same hill they had flattened for their common area. It was almost poetic. Underneath their celebration, he saw the cracks forming, a tiny symbol of what was to come. And when fireworks burst above the new homes that night, he made a silent promise. When the final mortgage closed, when the last nail was hammered, he would walk into court. And this entire neighborhood, every street, every fence, every mailbox, would legally belong to him again. By late summer, the quiet mountain valley had transformed into a living monument of arrogance. Everywhere he looked, there were manicured lawns, expensive SUVs, and freshly painted mailboxes standing like trophies of conquest. But beneath that perfect surface lay something fragile, a lie so deep it was waiting to crack open under its own weight. He didn't need to swing a hammer or raise his voice. All he needed was paper, the kind that tells the truth when people try to bury it. His dining room had become a museum of evidence. Stacks of documents rose like pillars: property maps, county filings, tax receipts, photos printed and labeled by date. Each one told part of the story, not of a man losing land, but of a system too greedy to care who owned it. At the center of the table sat the deed. Yellowed with age, fragile along the folds, but still legally binding. Signed by his grandfather, notarized under the laws that hadn't changed in 50 years. Every inch of those 47 acres belonged to him. No amendments. No transfers. No exceptions. He spent hours cross-checking coordinates, measuring property lines on satellite imagery, comparing survey data to construction permits. Each click of the mouse uncovered another inconsistency. According to county records, the HOA's development permit covered only 30 acres. The rest, including most of the newly built homes, sat squarely within his boundaries. He took a breath and leaned back in his chair. That was it. The confirmation. The truth buried in numbers and ink. He wasn't fighting emotion anymore. He was fighting paperwork, and he was winning. Over the next several weeks, he visited public offices that most people forget exist. The county clerk, the land assessor, even the archives department in a windowless building filled with the smell of dust and time. He learned that the Ridgeline Heights permit had been fast-tracked by a developer who'd already been fined twice for zoning violations. He found stamped letters from a building inspector, a man who conveniently retired right after signing off on the illegal construction. He even located the bank mortgage filings, where the developers had used falsified land surveys to secure funding. Each new document was a thread, and he was pulling them one by one. Slowly, the entire web began to unravel. The HOA president, once proud and untouchable, had signed half the documents without reading them. The law firm representing them had filed forms under an expired corporate license. And the developers had accidentally recorded a land transfer referencing a non-existent parcel number. It wasn't just corruption, it was incompetence wrapped in arrogance. He documented everything, time-stamped and notarized copies of each record, storing digital backups in encrypted drives. He wasn't going to let this case depend on memory. He wanted a wall of evidence so solid that even the most expensive lawyer couldn't dent it. Sometimes at night, when the house grew quiet, he'd walk out to the edge of his remaining land. He'd look down at the glowing windows of the new houses below, families laughing, porch lights flickering, the hum of televisions through thin walls. He didn't hate them. They were victims too, buyers who never knew they were living on stolen soil. But the HOA, the board, the ones who'd signed the papers, they knew. And soon they'd face what they'd built. By autumn, he had a binder nearly 6 inches thick, labeled in clean handwriting. Ridgeline Heights, ownership evidence. He sat with his lawyer, a quiet man with silver hair and patience that matched his own. The attorney reviewed the documents for hours, then finally nodded. There was no dispute left. This wasn't an argument. It was theft. The plan was simple but devastating. They would file a property claim lawsuit, naming the HOA, the developer, and every board member as defendants. Because the homes were built on his legally owned land, all improvements technically belonged to him. Every wall, every pipe, every light fixture, everything. And that's what would destroy them. The law doesn't care who built the structure. It only cares who owns the ground it stands on. He filed the lawsuit quietly, strategically. No press. No warnings. Just a ripple in the legal system that would soon become a tidal wave. Within days, the HOA received official notices. Phone calls began flying between members, emails bursting with panic. They tried to reach the developers, but the shell company had already dissolved. The bank froze their accounts pending investigation. Mortgage companies began to call, confused by the sudden ownership dispute. Within weeks, chaos spread through the perfect neighborhood like wildfire. The HOA president's confident tone vanished. Board meetings turned into shouting matches. Homeowners demanded answers, and refunds. The man watched it all from afar. He didn't celebrate. He didn't post online. He just waited, because the hardest part wasn't proving the truth, it was watching people finally see it. As winter approached, the case moved forward. The HOA tried to settle quietly, offering him money to resolve the misunderstanding. But this wasn't about money anymore. It was about principle, about showing that paper and greed could never erase a family's legacy. He refused every offer. Instead, he gathered the final pieces: an affidavit from the county recorder, statements from 2 witnesses who'd seen the original survey markers, and drone footage showing property overlaps. Everything pointed in one direction: the truth. Then, one morning, the official court date arrived. Snow dusted the mountains as he dressed in a simple black suit. The same man who'd once been escorted out of his own land now held a binder that could dismantle an empire. He stood in the mirror for a moment, steady, calm. Not angry. Not nervous. Just ready. The courthouse loomed tall against the gray sky, its marble steps cold under his boots. Inside, the hum of whispers and camera shutters filled the air. Word of the lawsuit had finally reached the local press. As he walked past the reporters, his focus didn't waver. This wasn't about attention. It was about justice. And when he stepped through the courtroom doors, binder in hand, he knew exactly what he was about to do. Pull the deed out, the same one his grandfather signed, and end the lie once and for all. The courtroom was cold that morning. Not in temperature, but in silence, the kind that feels heavy, like the air itself knows something monumental is about to happen. Rows of spectators filled the benches, whispering as the man took his seat behind the plaintiff's table. Across from him sat the HOA president, flanked by her lawyers, expensive suits, polished smiles, the kind of people who had never known what it meant to lose something that truly mattered. She glanced at him once, smirking faintly, as if the last 6 months of chaos had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. But her confidence was an illusion. Her attorneys had built their defense on paperwork, the same kind of paperwork he had already dismantled. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The war began. The opening arguments were predictable. The HOA's lawyers painted him as an opportunist, someone exploiting technical errors to profit from honest homeowners. They showed slides of happy families, children playing in yards, American flags waving beside their perfect homes. They wanted the court to feel sympathy, to believe that taking this neighborhood away would be cruel. He didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. Because sympathy doesn't rewrite the law. When it was his turn, his lawyer stood, calm, deliberate, the same man who'd sat in silence through months of preparation. He opened a single folder, revealing copies of the original land deed, tax receipts, and a map from 1971. Then came the evidence, a mountain of it. Each page was projected on the screen. The official county plat map showing his property line running through the center of Ridgeline Heights. The falsified notary seals. The fraudulent permit signatures. The zoning documents signed under expired licenses. And finally the photographs, homes built directly on top of his survey markers, still visible under the grass. The courtroom murmured. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Even the HOA's attorneys began to shift uncomfortably. Then came the most devastating moment, the title record comparison. 2 copies side by side, one, the original deed bearing his grandfather's name, the other, a forged transfer document claiming the land had been acquired by the HOA's developer. The signatures didn't match. The notary stamp was dated 3 years before the developer's company even existed. The truth hit the room like thunder. The judge leaned back, expression hardening. He asked a single question, a quiet one that echoed louder than any argument. Who authorized construction before verifying ownership? No one answered. The HOA president looked to her lawyers. They looked to the floor. Silence filled the space again, this time heavier, sharper, final. As the evidence presentation continued, the layers of deception peeled away. The man sat still, hands folded, listening as years of greed unraveled word by word. Every exhibit entered into record was a small piece of justice restored, a voice for the land, for his grandfather, for every quiet person crushed under arrogance and paperwork. The defense tried to argue confusion, that boundary lines were unclear, that county records had errors. But the evidence destroyed those claims. His deed had been verified by 2 independent surveyors, both testifying under oath. The maps matched perfectly. The HOA's own insurance documents even referenced the wrong parcel numbers, proof they'd never verified their construction site at all. The weight of the truth became impossible to ignore. The HOA president's earlier confidence faded. Her hands trembled as she whispered to her attorney, eyes darting between the judge and the screen. For the first time, she understood, this wasn't just a lawsuit. It was exposure. The trial stretched for days. Each session brought another revelation, another paper trail connecting the developers to forgery, negligence, and deceit. Journalists started attending. The story spread. Local man claims 96 homes built on his land. Public sympathy shifted fast. By the 3rd day, the HOA's lawyers attempted a desperate settlement, an offer in writing for a multi-million-dollar payout in exchange for silence and withdrawal. He refused. Money couldn't replace the forest that once stood there. It couldn't replace the promise his grandfather made to protect that land. This was never about profit. It was about the principle that truth doesn't vanish just because someone builds over it. Finally, on the 4th day, closing arguments began. The HOA's counsel tried to salvage pride, citing community harm, the potential displacement of families, and the moral unfairness of the outcome. But their words sounded hollow against the mountain of proof. When the judge gave his verdict, the room held its breath. Every sound seemed to vanish. Even the faint hum of the ceiling lights disappeared beneath the tension. The decision was clear. The court recognized the plaintiff, the rightful owner, as the legal holder of all property known as Ridgeline Heights. Every home, every fence, every brick built upon it was lawfully his. The HOA's permits were invalidated. The developers were referred for criminal investigation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The HOA president's face went pale, her posture collapsing as the realization set in. 96 homes, millions of dollars of property, now legally belonged to the man she tried to intimidate. He didn't smile. He simply closed his binder, stood up, and walked out. There was nothing left to say. Outside the courthouse, the mountain air was sharp and clean. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but he walked straight past them. The sun was setting over the same ridge that once belonged to his grandfather, now, finally, back where it belonged. He stopped at his truck, resting a hand on the door handle, and looked down at the valley below. The rooftops gleamed in the fading light, silent and still. What had once been a monument to greed was now a symbol of justice. But the story wasn't over yet. Owning the land was one thing. Deciding what to do with it, that would be the real test. As he drove down the road, snow began to fall again, slow, soft, almost forgiving. He didn't know what would happen to the families living there, but he knew one thing for sure. The land was his again. And the people who tried to erase his legacy would never forget his name. The judgment hit the community like an earthquake. In one day, the people of Ridgeline Heights went from proud homeowners to tenants standing on borrowed land. The moment the verdict was announced, phone lines flooded with confusion. Mortgage companies froze accounts, title insurance agents panicked, and HOA members bombarded their president with desperate calls that went unanswered. By evening, the story had gone national. Man wins lawsuit, takes ownership of 96 homes. News vans crowded the mountain road. Reporters broadcast live from the gated entrance that now belonged to him. He watched it all from the quiet of his cabin, the same cabin they once called a safety violation in their reports. But this time, he wasn't angry. He just felt still. After months of silence, struggle, and humiliation, the war was over. But peace didn't come easily. The HOA president resigned within hours. Her resignation letter leaked to the press, a bitter, defensive document blaming system errors and miscommunication, refusing to admit fault. The remaining board members held an emergency meeting in the community center. But without legal control, their authority meant nothing. The HOA charter was effectively void. The families who lived there were innocent, but terrified. Some cursed his name, calling him greedy, cruel, heartless. Others reached out quietly, asking what would happen next. He didn't blame them. They'd spent their savings, taken out loans, and built their lives on land that was never truly theirs. And now, they wanted to know, would he evict them? He didn't answer right away. Because truthfully, he didn't know. Owning 96 homes sounded powerful on paper, but it came with moral weight, a kind of responsibility no one could prepare for. He could demolish it all, sell the land, or let them stay. Each choice carried consequences. The developers had vanished. Their company, dissolved before trial, left behind unpaid taxes, frozen assets, and lawsuits from every direction. Investigations revealed falsified permits, kickbacks, and bribes, a network of corruption that reached deep into the county's building department. Arrests followed. The former building inspector was handcuffed outside his suburban home. The county supervisor resigned under pressure. The house of cards collapsed exactly as it had been built, fast and without mercy. But none of that brought back the forest. None of it restored the quiet beauty that once blanketed the ridge. Some nights, he drove down the winding road and parked outside the development's stone entrance. The Ridgeline Heights sign still stood there, half buried in snow. Through the windows of the houses, he saw lives continuing, children doing homework, couples cooking dinner, porch lights flickering against the dark. The neighborhood looked peaceful, even beautiful. Yet he couldn't forget what it had cost. Days turned into weeks. He received hundreds of emails from strangers, some congratulating him, others accusing him of destroying families. Social media twisted the story, calling him a land baron, a vindictive recluse, a hero, and a villain. Everyone had an opinion. But no one knew the truth, that he never wanted fame, only fairness. When the sheriff's department contacted him about enforcing ownership, he asked for time. He didn't want to throw people out in winter. He wanted to do this right, carefully, legally, and maybe even compassionately. He met with his lawyer again, this time not as a fighter, but as a man looking for balance. The attorney reminded him that he now had full control of the HOA land and assets, including the park, the lake access, and even the community budget account, which still held over $400,000 in resident dues. He could have emptied it. He didn't. Instead, he made a plan that surprised everyone. He filed paperwork to dissolve the HOA permanently and reorganize the community under private ownership, giving each family the chance to buy back their property directly from him, fairly, legally, and at cost. No inflated prices. No tricks. Just redemption. The news spread like wildfire again, this time, in a different tone. Headlines read: Man who won HOA lawsuit offers fair chance for residents to stay. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. People who once saw him as a villain began to call him the man who stood his ground. But not everyone was happy. The former HOA president tried to appeal the decision. She hired new lawyers claiming emotional distress and defamation. The court rejected her appeal in less than 2 minutes. Meanwhile, the families began meeting with him one by one. He set up a small desk in the community hall, the same hall where he'd once been thrown out. Now he sat at the front, signing new contracts with people who had once called security on him. Every family left with relief in their eyes and legal ownership papers in hand. By the end of spring, nearly 80 homes had been restored to their rightful residents. 16 remained unsold, properties whose owners had fled or refused to speak. He decided to donate 5 to veterans' families through a local housing charity. The rest he planned to sell at market value to rebuild what his grandfather's forest once represented: opportunity. The story had come full circle. The man who lost everything now held the power to give it back. But even in victory, he carried the weight of what was gone: the old trees, the mountain silence, the legacy of untouched wilderness. He spent long evenings walking the outskirts of the development, listening to the wind through the last remaining pines. It wasn't the same forest anymore, but it was still home. The HOA sign was gone now. In its place stood a simple wooden marker carved with a single word: Ridgeline. No. Heights. No. Association. Just the ridge. Just the land. The story was no longer about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity, history, and peace. He'd done what most people only dream of: fought back against power and won. But in the quiet that followed, he realized the real victory wasn't in the court ruling, or the deeds, or the headlines. It was in keeping his promise, the one written in faded ink decades ago. Don't let them take what's yours. That promise had carried him through every insult, every lie, every long night alone at that table under the lamplight. Now, that same light glowed from hundreds of windows across the ridge, families who could stay because one man refused to give up. Years passed. The noise faded, the headlines quieted, and the ridge finally learned silence again. The man still lived there, in the same cabin where it all began, surrounded by the same hills his grandfather once walked. But the land no longer felt angry. The scent of pine had returned, faint but steady, carried through the valley each morning like a whisper of forgiveness. Where Ridgeline Heights once stood as a symbol of arrogance, it had become something gentler, a neighborhood that remembered. The people who stayed learned to care for the land, not just live on it. They planted trees where bulldozers once tore roots apart. They built wooden benches along the trails and marked them with small brass plates engraved with the names of the family who once owned the ridge. The HOA was gone forever. No more fines. No more politics. Instead, the residents formed a cooperative, informal, simple, built on mutual respect. The rules were few: maintain your space, respect your neighbors, protect the land. No one argued. After what they'd witnessed, they knew what power could destroy. The man kept to himself, aging quietly, working his garden, repairing his tools, fixing fences that no longer separated enemies but connected friends. People still waved when they saw him in town. Some thanked him for saving their homes. Others nodded silently, out of respect for what he'd endured. He didn't speak much about the past anymore. He didn't need to. The land spoke for him now. But sometimes, late in the evening, he would drive up the ridge road and stop at the overlook. From there, he could see the entire valley, the rows of roofs glinting under the sun, the faint shimmer of the lake, and the line of young pines stretching toward the horizon. He'd lean against his truck and watch the light change. There was peace in that, not the kind that comes from victory, but the kind that follows closure. Every so often, he received letters from strangers, people who'd read about his case in law journals, or seen the documentaries that came later. Some called him a legend, others a hero. He didn't feel like either. He was just a man who refused to be erased. One letter came from a young woman, a law student. She wrote that his story inspired her to study property law, to protect others from the same kind of theft. She'd grown up nearby, she said, and remembered hearing adults whisper about the man who took back a neighborhood. Now she wanted to learn how he did it. He smiled when he read it. He didn't reply, but he placed the letter in the old deed folder, beside his grandfather's note. In some way, the fight had already passed to another generation. The world had changed since the court case. Developers had grown more cautious, counties more transparent. Every major project in the region now required triple verification of land ownership before approval. Officials quietly referred to it as the Ridgeline Clause. He never asked for credit. But he knew what it meant, that his struggle had built a wall stronger than any fence. On the anniversary of the court ruling, the residents held a small community event. They invited him, but he stayed at the edge, leaning against the fence near the park that once stood on stolen soil. Children ran through the grass, their laughter echoing across the same ground that had once echoed with hammers and drills. There was no bitterness in him anymore, only quiet pride. A local reporter approached him that day, asking if he regretted anything. He thought about it for a long time. About the forest that was gone, the years he'd spent fighting, the isolation that came with doing what was right. And then, finally, he answered softly. He said that regret only belongs to those who lose their purpose. And his purpose had always been clear: to keep a promise. That night, he returned to his cabin and placed a lantern on the porch. It was the same lantern his grandfather had used during those long mountain winters decades before. The flame inside flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows that danced like memories. He sat there, watching the glow, thinking of all that had changed. The world had moved on, but the ridge remained, alive, restored, and finally free of ownership disputes and greed. Sometimes he thought he could almost hear his grandfather's voice in the wind, carried through the pine trees, a quiet laugh, proud and content. As the years rolled forward, his story became more than a case. It became a warning, a lesson, and an inspiration. Students studied it. Lawyers cited it. Ordinary people shared it online as proof that one person could still stand against corruption and win. He never sought fame, yet it found him anyway, not in wealth, but in respect. When he finally passed away, it was quietly, in his sleep, inside the same cabin that had started it all. The community mourned him like a founding father. Flags flew at half-staff, neighbors left flowers by his porch, and the local paper printed his favorite quote beneath his photograph. "Don't let them take what's yours." In his will, he left clear instructions: no monuments, no plaques, no naming roads after him. Just one final request: to scatter his ashes along the ridge beside the trees his grandfather once planted. And that's what they did. On a still spring morning, the residents gathered at the overlook. The young woman, now a lawyer, held the urn. She spoke softly about justice, resilience, and legacy, and then released the ashes into the wind. They rose high, carried across the valley, drifting over rooftops, lawns, and a quiet lake that once reflected construction cranes. For a moment, it felt like the mountain itself exhaled. Down below, a wooden sign stood at the entrance to the community. No longer carved with corporate branding or HOA slogans. Just two words, simple and eternal. Ridgeline Freehold. Because the ridge was never about property. It was about freedom. The families lived on. The trees grew back.